Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. The topic this morning is the United States and the Red Decade. And we're fortunate to have with us to talk about the United States and the Red Decade, Miss Alana McLaughlin. Alana, let me welcome you to the show this morning. And I'm sure that you are no stranger in a real sense to our audience this morning. And I think earlier we were able to determine that you've been with us since you were 10 years old. And this says, I guess this is about your 8th year, beginning with a new season. But nevertheless, there might be some few people, Alana, who might not know you. And so in order to make sure that all of our audience know you and some of the things that you've been involved with, why don't you start us off by giving us some information in reference to your background, your education, and some of the experiences that you have gone through recently as well as earlier. And so let's start off by that, and then after that we'll talk about the United States and the Red Decade.
Well, as previously stated, my name is Alana McLaughlin. I began the show when I was 8, and this is my 7th year with the show. I am a sophomore at the Nashville School of the Arts, and my specialty is trumpet and concert band. I am heavily involved in many organizations, like for instance, I am an alumna of the Junior National Young Leaders Conference, the Summer Camp for Verbally and Mathematically Precocious Youth at Western Kentucky University, and the Summer Camp for Academically Talented Students, also at Western Kentucky University. For sports and activities of the sort, I do play trumpet for Pearl Cone High School. I am in their marching band of tradition. And I do things that revolve around me playing trumpet and things that specialize in my art. For instance, the Lady Antebellum concert that recently passed at Bridgestone Arena, the Nashville School of Arts was invited to perform at, and me and a couple other hand-picked students were performing with them on stage, which was a great experience. It was a great concert. So that's a bit about my background and my education, and that's basically the overview of Alana McLaughlin.
So Alana, today you want to talk about a topic that I'm sure that a large number of people have a real interest in, and that is the Soviet Union. And so in a real sense, you want to talk about the Red Decade, to make some statements in reference to the Soviet Union or Russia and the Red Decade. Now, a large number of our audience might not understand exactly what you mean when you talk about the Red Decade. So before we get into a discussion in reference to that, start us off with why this topic is important and the real name of the topic that you're dealing with this morning.
Well, the Red Decade was a period in the 1930s here in the U.S. where Stalinism and communism, people were infatuated with it, and politicians and journalists and higher-ups were so pro-communism, which is strange to think about because nowadays if you go around preaching communism and Stalinism and Marxism, people are going to look at you like you're insane, or well, the majority of U.S. citizens. And so this period, this term, the Red Decade, was coined by American journalist Eugene Lyons, which is slightly ironic because before Eugene Lyons stopped supporting communism, he was very pro-communism. He considered himself a part of the Stalinist Communist Party, and he did preach communism, just like it was almost a fad back in the 30s. And the Red Decade is also what really put a dent in Ayn Rand, the prolific writer, her career here in the U.S. Because if you are familiar with Ms. Rand, she is from communist Russia, and she left there to come to the U.S. And so basically, this Red Decade was just a period of time of ignorance for the United States.
In other words, everybody was in love with Russia. This was a period immediately after the Second World War. And so communism really did not seem as bad as many people thought that communism was later on. And so this is why they are infatuated, as you indicated, with this whole idea of communism, socialism, and anything other than democracy in a real sense. And so you think that it was during this decade that things sort of changed, and some of the things that we know about Russia and the Soviet Union now will be quite different in terms of some of the things that you will say over the next 30 minutes that we have talking about this show. And so what we're going to do, we're going to take our first commercial break, and then we'll come back and we'll give you an opportunity to talk about a period that many people might not be familiar with, but I'm sure that you have all the information. And so we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Alana McLaughlin, and she's giving us some information in reference to the United States and the Red Decade. Now, Alana, since you have already given us some information relative to how the Red Decade got its name, let's start off by giving you an opportunity to make some statements in reference to communism, the Red Decade, or anything that would fit within that framework over the next 8 minutes.
Well, for our viewers just tuning in the last segment I introduced myself, but most of the last segment was me talking about the United States and what was called the Red Decade. Now, the Red Decade was a term coined by American journalist Eugene Lyons, and it was to describe the point in time in the 1930s where the United States and American journalists and politicians and higher-ups, everybody who was somebody was infatuated with Stalinism and communism and the communist parties and, the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, and all these things. And it's ironic that Eugene Lyons, of all people, would be the one to coin this term of the time where the United States was so ignorant, per se, because Eugene Lyons was once a communist. He was a part of the Communist Party, and he had strong communist beliefs before his entire mindset changed and he started speaking out against communism and against the party that he once followed, and ended up coining that period of the 30s as the Red Decade. Now, if you're not familiar with communism, communism was a political theory which was coined by Karl Marx, which in layman's terms basically said that all property owned is public property, and that all citizens, all men and women, will work and be paid based on abilities and needs. So equality, they wanted to make people equal per se, but that's not really what was working out. And this was coined by Karl Marx, and some characteristics of a communist society would be women not having rights, and this women not having rights ties into the next person that we're going to talk about, which is Ayn Rand. Now, Ayn Rand is an author. She's famous for books like We the Living, The Fountainhead, and Anthem.
Atlas Shrugged.
Yes. And all these books all have a type of, they all have something similar within them. It could be the theme of, say, a communist-like society or a Stalinist type views and things like that. They all revolve around either everyone being equal or no one being equal. Anthem, for instance, it talks about a society where everyone they don't even have names. They're all either equality or liberty, and your jobs are chosen for you, and it is illegal to think alone, it is illegal to write, it is illegal to be an individual until the end of the book where these people break free. And now in We the Living, which was published in 1936 but finished in 1934, Ayn Rand had left communist Russia and came all the way from there to Hollywood here in the U.S. in California. And she left because she knew that speaking out against the Communist Party, which is what she basically did in We the Living, was not going to fly in communist Russia. So she came to the U.S. because the U.S. almost just prides itself in being somewhere where you can openly discuss what you like and openly feel however you want to feel. Equality, where you can be equal. And we don't have a society where, you know, you'll get a slap on the wrist for being an individual, or at least, you know, Ayn Rand thought that this was not that type of society. So when she came here to Hollywood, she did not speak good English at all. And so what Ayn Rand did was she started working in short films to try to make money as she was trying to become a famous writer, because silent films, the language barrier doesn't really affect it because it's a silent film. So she made some money off of that, and enough money to write We the Living and get it finished in 1934. Now, she was very, very excited to publish this here in the U.S. because she was just so excited, because this was the height of the Red Decade, and she just knew that by publishing this book exposing all of these communist issues, it would completely change the mindset of the U.S. She was turned down by 9 publishers until in 1936, Macmillan finally accepted the book and published it. But like I said, this was the height of the Red Decade, and her book did not make any money at all. She made about $100 in U.S. royalties at the time, that after they had sold less than 3,000 copies, and they ended up stopping copies of the book.
And so in a real sense, this decade is primarily, now Ayn Rand, she played a very, very important part, not only at this particular time, but she was also significant later on, was she not?
She was. After We the Living came The Fountainhead and Anthem and all these books, and she became a very successful writer. But it's just so strange that she had this book that went on to win many accolades and awards that no one wanted to read. And this is what makes you think about, okay, why did no one want to read this? What was wrong with this book? It was exposing the truth. It was beautifully written. Ayn Rand had talent and writing skills that no one had seen from a woman who was just new to the U.S. And it makes you think, why did no one read this book? And that's what the Red Decade did. The Red Decade was almost the fall of Ayn Rand before she even started her career here in the United States.
And when you say the Red Decade, you're talking about that 10-year period that started with something great in reference to communism, but all of a sudden it ended.
Yes.
And after that decade, in a real sense, communism had another understanding as far as the American public was concerned. Now, what changed the minds of many people in the public in reference to communism?
Well, depending on who you ask, answers to this question will vary. Me personally, I believe that once people really started to read We the Living and saw what the Communist Party was really like, it changed mindsets. It was just a domino effect. It started from one book to the next book to the next book until finally people were reading this, and as much as they hated it, they could not dispute it.
And so in a real sense, Russia, the Soviet Union, now after that period becomes a different place as far as many Americans were concerned. And in a real sense, we are within the terms of the end of the Red Decade, and most of us have a perception of Russia now after the Red Decade, which is entirely different. And so what we'll do, we'll come back after this second short break, and we'll give you an opportunity during this last segment to talk about that. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Alana McLaughlin, and she's giving us some information in reference to the United States and the Red Decade. Now, Alana, during this last segment, let's give you an opportunity to sort of explore for our audience some of the things in reference to the change in perception that many Americans had in reference to communism and in reference to Russia, and perhaps to sort of say something that will sort of bring some of the attitudes that many of us have in reference to Russia today into our conversation here. Let's do it from that perspective.
Now, a common theme that I was talking about in the previous segment was the U.S. being so blind to something, because the technical term for the Red Decade is that it was a political period coined by Eugene Lyons, the American journalist and philanthropist and all this. And this period basically described how the U.S. was infatuated with Stalinism and communism, and they were just so loving at this, and they thought it was just this great idea. And looking back, 50, 60, 70, whatever, years later, everyone's going to think, and everyone thinks, how did the U.S. not see that this was not okay? How did the U.S. see that communist Russia was so bad that Ayn Rand fled for her life and came to the U.S., and that's how she started her career? How did they not see that she ran so that she could have the right to feel like a person, to be a woman, to be an author, to do everything that she wanted to do, to speak out against things? How did you not see that this was not okay? And it makes me think about during the Holocaust, how did the U.S. not see that this wasn't okay? Because if you've studied the Holocaust deeply enough, you know that magazines like Time and the Red Cross and all this would go to Germany and go to all these concentration camps and would look around because they heard rumors of, there's gas chambers, there's crazy medical experiments going on, and they'd go here and take photographs, but everything would be cleaned up. So these organizations, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, all them would come back to the U.S. and spread the good word of just how, they're just work camps. They're just camps for people who are homeless or people who want to make extra money. They're just working grounds. How were we so blind to see something like this? And that's basically a big thing with the U.S. We're so blind to things at times, and this is all because of the fact that people never really know who to listen to. There's always fake news and things like that, and depending on what your perception of fake news is, you may or may not be believing the right thing. But who am I to say that there's a right thing to believe? For instance, the people during the Red Decade who were infatuated with communism and Stalinism, they were probably getting lies put in their ears, this is just so successful and it makes everyone united and blah, blah, blah. And they believed that that was right. While the people like Ayn Rand, who experienced it firsthand, came back and told of their struggles, she was just branded as fake news. She was branded as, she's lying. She's just saying this to get money to make sales off her books. And it's really it's almost scary, because back in the 30s, if people could easily spread lies and et cetera, think of 2017, where we have technology, we have Facebook, phones, email, anything you hear could be fake. And it's just very scary to think about, because we could have another Red Decade, or say where we start glamorizing places like North Korea and things like that. And we do have people here in the United States who do that, but it's not a widespread thing. It's not big enough to have a whole term coined for it. But it's just disheartening to think about, just so much could go on. So much just could be lied about. And it really makes you think like you have to choose and pick what you want to hear, but you also have to get information from all sources. I believe that people who were active followers of communism and Stalinism, who would read We the Living by Ayn Rand, which is her book that spoke out against the Communist Party and all this in communist Russia, I believe that if people would have read that, it would have changed their mindsets quicker. Because in the previous segment, I did talk about how she finished We the Living in 1934. We the Living didn't hit the shelves until 1936 because over the 2-year period between 34 and 36, 9 publishers turned her down. Because when I tell you, everyone was just in love with communism. And it's just so scary to think about how could this happen. But when Macmillan finally picked up her book, it's funny, the associate editor of Macmillan, Granville Hicks, was an active part of the Communist Party, and he really did not want to publish We the Living. So when it was finally published, they sold less than 3,000 copies, and she made about $100 off of that book until it was revised and republished, and that's when the book actually became famed. But Ayn Rand's career almost ended before it started, just because of how ignorant we were to the truth, which is the same as people who go around saying that the Holocaust never happened or that slavery never happened. All these people are just blind to the truth. And their perception of real is not our perception of real, nor is it the people who experienced its perception of real. But it all brings us back to the topic that in the U.S., everyone can think what they want to think. In the United States, everyone can say what they'd like to say, and you can do as you please. So I can't bash people who were a part of the Red Decade. I know that they did not have the right thoughts, but I can't bash them for that because this is what they wanted to do. And it's just as simple as that. They were in a country where it is legal to be who you want to be, to do what you want to do, which is really what made Ayn Rand come over here in the first place.
Well, look, I think that the information that you've given us really opened our eyes in terms of what is going on around us now, dealing with Russia and some of the issues that are involved with communism and with socialism and some of the desires on the part of Russia to take over some of the situations in the United States. And I think that by giving that information, you've helped to open our eyes in reference to a different period, in reference to the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, or the United States and Russia, which is entirely different from how we perceive Russia today. And so after this decade, things started to change, you believe.
Yes, sir.
And the changes that came about, we're living really in part of those changes today. Would you believe?
I would agree with that statement fully. We're living in change of that entire mindset today. I believe that if the Red Decade became the Red Century, we would be living in a communist society right now, which is not something that a lot of people would want to live in.
But the information I think that you've given sort of opens us up to this idea of how things change and how different perceptions at different times. Because back in the 1930s, and of course I think that one of the other things that would probably play a significant role is the fact of the World War. The war that started in 1941 that ended in 1945 had a different understanding of communism and socialism after that particular time. And so I think that that might have had a real part in terms of our change in perception of what Russia was and what Russia is today. But anyway, I think that the information that you've given sort of not only opened my eyes, but I think it opened a lot of people's eyes in reference to some of the things that came about. And so I really think that you played a very, very significant role.